Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
My stress levels are very high. And also at the time, demand had suddenly, so what happens historically in primary care is there's a new contract roughly every 12 years or so. And GPs were fed up. This was 2013, 14, and I thought, you know what? No one values us. I'm going to do a TEDx talk on generalism. It's not particularly sexy. No one really, why would you watch a talk on generalism? It sounds really dull, but it was important to me and it was really important to GPs, I felt. And in a way, this isn't the book I really wanted to write. I wanted to write something much more deep dive, but unless you're very well known, publishers don't take that kind of thing on. And I thought, and everywhere I went to were going, why don't you, you seem to be good at explaining stuff. Why don't you just write a book on well-being? I was like, so dull, well-being this, well-being that, because it's one of those slightly trigger words that people find irritating. And I was going, yeah, I'm like, well, I can.
Welcome to this episode. Today I'm joined by a special guest, Dr. Ayan Panja. He's a portfolio GP who has got almost 25 years of clinical practice. He's recently launched his new book, The Health Fix, and is also a podcast host of Saving Lives in Slow Motion. Hi, Dr. Panja. How are you doing?
Yeah, great. Thanks. How are you, Erwin?
I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for taking the time to discuss about your story today. For people who might not know you, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer that when people ask you to talk about yourself. I'm a GP. I'm still a 6-session NHS GP partner, and that's really the core of what I do. And I love general practice. I would describe myself as a generalist through and through. I get bored very quickly, which is why hospital careers weren't for me because, not to demean anything that they do, if you're in a colorectal clinic, then you can pretty much guess what you're going to be doing all morning. And one of the things I love about general practice is the variety of what we do. I started out really at medical school being a little bit lost. So I wasn't sure I'd done the right degree. And I think a lot of people sometimes think that with medicine, where medics generally have lots of other things that they could have done or other talents. And I was a little bit confused, and I thought, wow, maybe I should have gone and studied English, or maybe I should have gone and done a degree in psychology or music or arts or something like that. And I spent a lot of my time doing musical things, in plays and musicals and in bands. And when I finished at med school, where I met my wife, we took 6 months off and thought, do we really want to do medicine? The thing that saved me really was in my 4th year, I did a GP attachment, and in my final year, I did a GP attachment. And those are the two things I enjoyed the most. I realized that general practice, certainly back then, was, and it still is to some extent, but less, is about people. It's not about diseases necessarily. And people's health journey is what I was interested in. I was fascinated by stories. And I think if you boil down your job and my job to this day, we listen to stories all day. And that's what made me sort of jump into general practice. And I'm still here. So, obviously it was the right choice. But along the way, I've done all sorts of other things, which I can tell you about.
It's very interesting to see how your career has evolved. And you've got that curiosity, which made me think you're really one of the journalists who has got this breadth of knowledge and always interested in learning new things. So tell me then, how did you think about developing a portfolio career?
It's interesting because there was no such thing in my day, really. And if you have a look on Google and look at things that I used to, there was a period where I used to write lots of small articles for the BMJ, nothing major, but little end pieces and comment pieces, which they don't do so much of anymore, which I think is a shame. But one of them was called, I think it was called something like Apple Crumble or a selection from the Sweet Trolley. And what that was referring to was when I was a GP trainee, a registrar, there was an accountants meeting and I was sitting in the accountants meeting with the partners. And one of the accountants said to me, so where are you going to end up working as a GP? And I said, I don't know yet. I don't know, maybe by the sea, maybe back in Brighton where I grew up, or I don't know, I might just dot around. And he was horrified. He was like, what do you mean dot around? You stay in one place for the whole of your life. That's what you do as a GP. And I remember feeling quite claustrophobic. And I wrote about this in the BMJ. And at that time, it was beginning to become a thing to be a salaried GP, which again hadn't existed. You were a partner or a locum, historically. Salaried GPs were new. And also there was suddenly other career options. You could become a gypsy, a GP with a special interest in something. Because I get bored quickly, that appealed to me. I'm sort of not bored of people and not bored of staying in one place, because I've been in one place for many years now, but just the variety of what you do. And I think that was the attraction. So how I got into other things was really by people telling you. So what I mean by that, when I was at med school, I used to do, a lot of music and acting and all that kind of stuff. And people used to say to me, "Oh, I can imagine you as a doctor on TV." And I always said, "I don't want to do that. That's just not me. It's not something I'm interested in. Don't stick that label on me." And then when I was, I think, a very green GP, this email came flying around from the BBC asking to audition GPs for Street Doctor, it came out at a similar time to Embarrassing Bodies. And what television production companies do, they have the same idea at the same time. So often the program that you're watching on Netflix, there may be lots of production companies pitching to make the same idea. And then, the network goes with one of them. And Street Doctor immediately got commissioned very quickly. And before I knew it, I was on BBC One at 7 o'clock at night, which means nothing these days, because nowadays we watch what we want, when we want. But back then there was still, it was the pre-Facebook era. It was 2006. Facebook was in its infancy, so there was no social media, and so most people did watch TV in the evenings, and so it was great, and I loved it. And then once you do one thing like that, other opportunities come your way. So particularly if you work in broadcast, people then want you to work on campaigns or health PR, or they want you to help them message, particularly health companies. I did a bit of that work for a while, and other work that's much more commercial, like voiceovers and things like that. And I think what happened back then was I was so excited at doing all these other things on top of everyday general practice. So I was a GP partner in North London at the time, in Haringey, and you can manage, because I didn't have as busy a family life. We were kind of a young couple, and I had all this spare time, and it was very full and very fulfilling. But the grounding always has been general practice and generalism, and I think that's the thing that is the golden thread that runs through anything that I've done. It's all about variety and people.
That's fascinating. I did watch your TED speech on journalism. Can you tell us a bit more about how have you thought about being a journalist, and how has this impacted on other areas that you've worked?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the TEDx talk, it was very selfish, really. Those sort of things you tend to do because you really want to do them. I was at this particular point in my career where three things were going on. One was that I had a terrible complaint against me at work, which ultimately wasn't anything to do with me. It was a clinical mishap, and actually an X-ray was misreported, but we didn't know this at the time, and the family involved were very sort of upset with me until this came out, that this X-ray had been misreported. And so that my stress levels were very high. And also at the time, demand had suddenly, so what happens historically in primary care is there's a new contract roughly every 12 years or so. And GPs were fed up. This was 2013, 14, and I thought, what, no one values us. I'm going to do a TEDx talk on generalism. It's not particularly sexy. No one really, why would you watch a talk on generalism? It sounds really dull. But it was important to me, and it was really important to GPs, I felt. And I wanted to get across just how difficult it is. So generalists have special skills. We're not specialists, but we're actually expert generalists. So we are much better at putting, content into context compared to a specialist. We're better at predicting future outcomes. This is not from me. This is all based on research, by a guy called Philip Tetlock, who is a professor at Wharton Business School. So he's written lots on generalists versus specialists, boxers and hedgehogs. So it was really vanity in some ways. I wanted to get the message out there that we are important and we are valid. And you'll know if you've seen it that I sort of play a game with the audience where I get them to work out which kind of doctor they'd go and see if they had a pain here, and they all say something different. And that's the whole point. We can filter things as generalists. I still think that's the core skill of what a GP does, whether it's by text message or whether it's by sort of, using different modalities, because historically it was just face to face and a little bit of phone work. And now it's, the patients and us interact in so many ways, don't we? I mean, it's, email, text message, video consultations, as well as in person, and the phone. So it was just important. I'm glad I did it, and there are one or two others now that have come along since then, which are also excellent. I'm not saying mine's particularly excellent, but I thought it was at the time. When I look back at it now, I think I would have done it differently, but it was almost 10 years ago and I was a bit younger and a bit angrier then. So, but I think it makes people think, which is what I wanted to do. Just spark that kind of inquisitiveness about what it is that generalists do.
I really enjoy watching it, and it did make me think about what generalists are really good at, and you encapsulated that very well in the talk. Sometimes when we do have complaints coming and we take it personally, it's one of those things that make us think about our practice and think about our career choice. I had a complaint last year, and this made me think about being a journalist and how to deal with so much work that we're getting. And as human beings, we will make mistakes, and it's normal, but it's how we learn from it. During that time, how did you handle that complaint, and what did you learn from there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, well, first thing to say is for the last several years, I'm the complaints lead at my practice. So all the partners have different hats, and one of mine is that. I'll come back to that particular one and how I dealt with it. But generally, my modality of dealing with them is if I know the patient. So because I've been at this practice now for 12 years, I was at my last one for about 8 years. I know a lot of the patients. If I know them, I'll ring them because it's much more effective, and you can nip things in the bud quickly by saying, look, I'm really sorry we messed up. Whether it's a complaint about me or one of the other team members, it doesn't really matter. What people want really is to acknowledge that something's gone wrong and that you're saying sorry. And the difficulty, although we have to use our defence organisations at times, especially for clinical complaints, the difficulty there is the longer the time between the complaint and your response, this silence kind of really makes the complainant quite angry. If you think about yourself and something's gone wrong with your bank or your boiler or your whatever, one of your services, the more you don't hear from them, the more annoyed you get. And so I try and take the steam out of it. If it's a much more serious one, so this one, it was no one's fault. It was, and without going into too much detail, it was a chap who I'd known for years actually and had come in with hip pain. The relationship had broken down between myself and the rest of his family. So there are some populations around where I live and work, just like where you live and work, are quite parochial, where all family members live within like a square mile, and it was a bit like this for this family. And I was really gutted because I got on so well with his other family members, and suddenly I was heartbroken, really. That had just been destroyed because of this mishap. It wasn't anyone's fault. It was just the way events took their course. So eventually with that one, I offered to meet the family face to face, and they were very, very angry at first. So then I just sort of listened. It was me and the practice manager, and you just got to sit there and take it, really. There's nothing you can do because you want to let them vent steam. And by the end of it, they were sort of like, well, thanks for your time, but this is nothing compared to what we're going to do to the hospital. They were really angry, and they wanted, and if you've ever lost anyone close to you who's died because of something medical, and it's harder these days to provide high quality care because of the resource issue. There aren't enough of us. There's not enough doctors, nurses, there's not enough people in healthcare to provide that level of service. People they really want to kind of blame someone. Often they want someone to take that anger off them, which is part of the grief process, as we know. But it all sort of, and eventually we sort of made up. So it all sort of, but actually while it was going on, it was horrible. Yeah. And so that was one of the things that sparked me to do the generalism talk, apart from the fact no one else was valuing us at the time.
Yeah, that's really useful because some early GPs, they might not know how to deal with this. It's always good to have some support. At the time, did you have anybody that you could talk to?
Yeah, this one definitely went to my defence organisation because it was one where I thought, hang on a minute, really need someone to look at this. And I was quite lucky. My partner's quite supportive, but I didn't have anyone someone else, like, I guess I could have used the BMA or someone like that, if I wanted someone to talk to, or there was at the time, I wasn't aware of things like practitioner health. I don't think I needed anything like that. I was because I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. I think, it's not about blame. And I do worry about us as a profession, because people do take complaints very personally, because you think, God, this is reflecting on me. I'm a bad person. And it's not that at all. It's just, we work in an environment that is inherently we're risk managers effectively, a lot of what we do. And when you're at the beginning of your GP career, I remember vividly actually, thinking when I started as a GP, you're listening to all these nebulous stories, and part of your brain's thinking, oh my God, everyone's got cancer or something, because you just sort of think, what is this? This is really weird, and suddenly they go, oh yeah, and also my arm goes numb quite a lot, and then I lose vision in one eye, but that's nothing, is it? And you think, oh my God, and all these, and trying to separate out not missing something, but also being quite human, blending the two is quite an art. It's quite difficult. You see it a lot in medical students, they're so desperate to get information out of the patient that they sort of forget, how to sort of talk, as though they're talking to a human being. And I think GPs generally, we're good at that, doing those two things. But equally, there's a resource thing. You can't just refer everyone for an MRI on their back if they've got back pain. It just doesn't work like that. So it's not easy. It's not easy. And it's just a case of practice and experience. And by experience, I don't mean in a sort of wise, long white beard way. I just mean pattern recognition. So, often with our wider team, like the paramedics, or we have lots of learners in our practice, FY2s and registrars and medical students from UCL who haven't had those years of listening to stories. And for example, a really quick and easy one that I saw the other day with our current medical student, who's excellent, I have to say, was a gentleman had been treated for, looked like staph skin infection on his forearms and his nose, had a week of flucloxacillin and fusidin, and it was still there. So I'd never met this chap. The student had called me into the next room to see this gentleman, and I said, I had a quick look at this chap's notes, and he's on bisoprolol, and I go, this is psoriasis. It's a really common side effect of beta blockers. I'm going to give you this cream. If it doesn't keep a lid on it, we might have to change your beta blocker. But I don't know the gentleman. I don't even know why he's on bisoprolol, and he's in his 80s. Yeah, and so the student thought I was some really clever guy, and I'm like, well, not really. It's because I know the fluclox didn't work, and I know it can't be many other things. And so that kind of, Bayesian thinking and that kind of hypothesis creation just gets easier and easier. And actually dealing with complaints, the key thing is, going back to that, not to take it personally. It's a little bit like patients who, it's very easy to say, oh, Mr. X or Mrs. X, oh, they're really irritating or they're really annoying. Actually, what's annoying and irritating are their behaviors. It's not them. You have to separate their behavior from them. Otherwise, you'll just end up hating everyone. It's very easy thing to get sucked into, especially if you're stressed in primary care. You can easily start becoming a bit cynical. But the complaints, there's nothing we can do. We live in a complaints culture. If you look at the rest of the world and other industries, everyone wants feedback, good or bad. And guess what? In general practice, we get a lot more bad feedback than good. Our own practice, we've just revolutionized our sort of appointment system. So we now don't have a wait for anything. You can get an appointment the same day for anything pretty much. Whereas we were dying prior to this change in appointment. So we now use Accurix to triage everything. People are delighted with it. And the last 4 or 5 Google reviews we've had have been 5 stars, but they're buried under like so many 1 and 2 star ones. It still looks like we're a bad practice who's, underperforming. We're not at all. I would argue we're probably the most responsive practice around, in our patch anyway. Don't share this with people in St Albans, but the point is, it's very, very hard. The sector we work in is notoriously difficult, but don't get down about that. You just got to do what you want to do and cultivate your interests. Now is a great time. General practice is the best specialty to be in for that. You can do anything. You can go and work as a ship's doctor. You can go and do TV work. You can work in pharmaceutical medicine. I'm not trying to talk you out of a career in general practice, because general practice is at the core of this, and you can still, have a great career.
Thank you for sharing this, because it's really important to talk about this. So many doctors are thinking about leaving general practice these days, and even GP trainees who've not CCT'd yet are already thinking of exit. So how can we make this profession more attractive and make people want to have fulfilling life in general practice? And Ayan, because it sounds to me that you're quite happy in your general practice career and you've managed to develop a career that satisfies yourself.
Yeah, it always looks rosy, and I'd be really honest, it's not been easy, and I've been close to burning out at points where I thought, actually, this is just too much, and I do work long hours, and some days I'm at work for 14 hours. So it's not that it's easy, and so it is hard work. And there are two or three things really. What we've worked very hard on is the culture at the practice. So on my podcast, I cover things like, so I've just done an episode just before speaking to you on kindness, which isn't out yet, but it will be soon. The psychology and the science behind it. Is it important? Why is it important? We always talk about be kind, all that sort of stuff. But a lot of the topics I cover on it, say, for example, stress and anxiety, it doesn't take a genius to work out whether someone's anxious or depressed. Actually a clever non-medic, not even a clever non-medic, it's pretty obvious when someone's got that. And it's not difficult to offer them counselling or an antidepressant. You don't have to become a doctor to for that level of thinking. More important is, well, how's this person come to this point? And often it's people's work culture. And I'm proud that actually where we work, it's a safe, happy place to work. So there's no hierarchy. We're very compassionate in our sort of leadership style, and that makes everyone feel safe. The downside is actually it's almost too relaxed sometimes, and people get away with too much. They kind of go, I'm not coming in tomorrow because I did an extra 2 hours, on last week or something. And I think, well, hang on, what? No, we never said you could do that. Not that anyone does that, but that's the danger with being too flexible. And so one of the things is creating a good work culture. The second is knowing your limits, I think, and spotting signs if you're getting stressed and flagging them up really to your, line manager. And the third is sort of what is general practice. I think the difficulty at the moment, not long ago, I decided to take up my fellowship at the Royal College. I could have got it back in 2008, but I never bothered because I'm not very political. So BMA and all that stuff, they do great work. Not interested because it's not in my interest sort of mix, if you like. The college, I don't know, I never really got what they did. And then I thought, do you know what? Actually, if I want to make a difference, I need a seat at the table. Why don't I just take up the fellowship and then go along to a few meetings, which I haven't been to yet? But, if you're not part of making the change, you can never actually affect the change. And I think we're in a really low morale point in medicine, not just general practice. All doctors are struggling in the NHS. General practice is one of the better places to be. I don't know anyone who comes through our practice who doesn't leave slightly inspired and doesn't leave wanting to do it. Even our latest F2 doctor who was here for 4 months wants to be a GP. A lot of our medical students go, I didn't realise general practice was so interesting and so fascinating. I think I'm going to be a GP, and that's nice to hear. The retention thing, it worries me when you say that a lot of registrars are thinking of leaving already. I understand why. There's no blame or shame here at all. I totally get it. It's not a reflection on them. It's a reflection on the system and how we've ended up being forced to work by political pressures, and a lack of funding. Just to give you an idea as well of the workload, years ago, one of our current salaried doctors has become a partner. She's been with us for about 8 years now. And when she came 8 years ago, it was her first job in general practice. She's an excellent doctor. But when she joined us as a salaried doctor to replace a partner, we took her and 2 other salaried doctors on to replace one partner's workload. Because back then, the workload was I'm not saying it was more, but we had personal lists and we thought, well, we can't do personal lists anymore. So there's a bit of duplication. And one of the things that breaks my heart is the loss of continuity. And I worry that GPs like yourself, who's relatively in the beginnings of their career, won't ever see the value and the beauty of continuity, because occasionally there'll be a name that pops up through triage. And if I know that person, it will take me 30 seconds to work out why they've contacted us. Whereas someone who doesn't know them, and if they're particularly complex in terms of their history, it will take them half a day. They'll be like, I'm really confused. Why are they on that drug again? Not knowing that they'd reacted to 3 other drugs 30 years ago, whatever, you know what I mean? So, you know, and if you go to other parts of the world where healthcare is still a little bit like that, you know, lots of things are creeping into primary care now, like social prescribing and health coaching. You know, if you go to rural parts of the world, in Asia and Africa, the people that deliver health promotion are not doctors. They're not. You know, often there's a community of usually women who will have, you know, this box of cards, and they'll have family planning images on there, you know, talking, you know, and that's sort of health education. And we've kind of, the problem in primary care is we're tasked with all of it. You know, we're meant to do everything now. Half the stuff the hospital do has been pushed out to us, and we're meant to be doing proactive care. And it seems overwhelming. I think the way to do it is just focus on what you can do. The system is the system, and there's no easy, quick fix without a lot more funding, or without, you know, a political party really backing primary care. We're slightly stuck in this system. There are other options, of course. I know people often think about moving abroad or whatever, and that's totally up to them. But, you know, it's still a very rewarding career. If you get the culture right in terms of where you work, and you boundary yourself in terms of when you work and how you can work, I think you'll be okay, probably. It's a great job, honestly.
It sounds like, yeah, the culture is really important, because if you're working in a practice where you don't enjoy the people you're around with and you don't feel like you have a good camaraderie, that makes a big difference as in how you feel just going to work. So one of the things that you do very well is communicating health to the mass public. So you've written your book Health Fix. Tell us, how did you do that? Because I could see you've written a note that you don't take any work retreat to do this. You do not have any time off. Like, you were doing it as you were working as a GP.
Yeah, this is a really tricky one to answer, and I'll try and keep it short because I know you were short on time in a way. But so for me, because like I said, when I was at med school, there were lots of things I thought I might be able to do for a living apart from medicine. But when I really thought about them, for example, you know, I'm not saying I could do, and I'm not saying that these people don't do a very complicated job, but I could have gone and read the news. That's one thing that I can see myself have been doing as a living. Or I could have, you know, like a lot of people like this, you know, I'm sure people watching this think, yeah, I could have been a professional skier or whatever. You know, we've all got other things that we could do. And music, less so now, and writing are quite important to me. And in a way, this isn't the book I really wanted to write. I wanted to write something much more deep dive. But unless you're very well known, publishers don't take that kind of thing on. And I thought, and everywhere I went to were going, why don't you, you know, you seem to be good at explaining stuff. Why don't you just write a book on wellbeing? I was like, oh, so dull, you know, well-being this, well-being that, you know, because it's one of those slightly trigger words that people find irritating. And I was going, yeah, I'm like, well, I can. But anyway, I teach a course called Prescribing Lifestyle Medicine, which uses the format of what I've written in this book. And it came from my own experience of illness when I was, in fact, at the time I was doing the TED Talk, because at that time I suddenly put on loads of weight. My brain wasn't working. I could barely remember the words for that TED Talk. I really struggled to get through it. You won't be able to tell if you watch it. I almost died. And actually, the reason was I had this massive spike of stress. My daughter was very young and wasn't sleeping. So for 2 or 3 years, I was having hardly any sleep at night, which in itself can break people. Plus, I had this thing called dengue fever when I was traveling as a medical student in Malaysia. The three things completely just colluded, and boom, my health collapsed. It was almost like I had acute sort of dementia. My memory, you know, every time I used to work for the BBC at that time, I was going in every week on a Wednesday. I couldn't remember my lines, and they were going, "Are you okay?" And even one line I couldn't remember or spit it out. My neck was aching so badly that I remember I couldn't turn it when I got to a giveaway. My joints were really inflamed, and I was really tired. I couldn't digest my food. I was getting bloating after meals. But I realised the medical model couldn't really help me, because all I would get is a bunch of labels. People would just go, "Maybe you're depressed. Maybe you've got IBS, you know, maybe you've got seronegative arthritis." I love that one, you know, where nothing shows up and the rheumatologist just waits until there's positive antibodies. And I knew that wasn't the case. It took me about 6 months to figure my own sort of health out. And I came up with this thing that's the central part of the book called the health loop. Going back to how I wrote it, I just had to get it done. Unfortunately, in 2021, my dad suddenly sort of died unexpectedly. I had to move my mum, you know, I had to sell the house in Brighton, had to move my mum over to where I live. She lives a couple of miles away from me now. And all of that sort of meant I couldn't do any writing for several months. And suddenly they went, oh, your book's got to be in by March 2022. And on April the 1st, we were flying for this massive family holiday with 3 other families to Mauritius. And I thought, I've got to get this done somehow. So I asked my partners, I said, look, I need 3 weeks in one block just to write this book. And I did a bit of it first of all. And then every sort of few days, I'd send them a photo of how many words I'd done. I go, look, I've done 14,000, which is nowhere near, not even half a book. And I go, oh, I've got to 24,000, I just hammered it out. I think the other thing, Owen, and this is really key, the reason that's so easy for me to do, because you're thinking, well, you must be like, on speed or something. And it's not that. It's just my course, my podcast, my clinical work and my book now compared to what I was doing 15, 20 years ago, they all come from the same energy source. I'm completely aligned. Do you know what I mean? So when you're doing, a bit of voiceover work and a bit of PR work for a health company and a bit of your brain is sort of all over the place. And although it's nice to do those things and maybe earn a bit of money and you think, oh, that's really nice, they asked me to do that, that bit of work. Actually, it's not, if it's not in that part of the Venn diagram, I normally won't bother with it because it won't be aligned. Like I'm sure you've got friends, they've got a property business on the side. That is great, but it's exhausting when you get to a certain age. I'm 50 in a couple of months' time, and it's one of those things where unless you've got people managing those things for you, which again is a luxury and a cost, you want to really do things that chime with your own values. And so all of those things are one and the same, really. They're just, do you know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah. It sounds to me you found what you're good at, and now you're just pushing downhill, which is effortless to some degree. And I think that's a really good advice. I know that we're short on time, but a last word of advice for people watching.
Yeah, I think about alignment's really key. At the moment, we have a lot of young GPs that I bump into. I do talks for first 5 groups and things, and I can feel it in the room, exactly what you're saying, that there's a sense of slight disillusionment and fear in the room. And alignment is definitely something that I talk about, and when people, there's a couple of, these bright young thing GPs who kind of pick my brain and they go, well, do you think, digital medicine and health tech is the thing to go into? My answer to them is, are you interested in it? Because if you're not, there's no point. You can't just, it's a bit like children choosing their GCSEs. You don't do what your friends are doing. That's not going to work. You've got to do what you're good at and what you like. And whatever it is, whether it's lifestyle medicine or health tech, or whether it's, a startup in some sort of charity sector, if you enjoy it, just explore those things. The other thing I'd say is no learning is not valuable. As in, if you go on a course or a webinar and you think, oh, you know what, people go on about lifestyle medicine, what is it? And you do something, it's not wasted. It's part of your armory. You've actually learned something useful. It'll help you in some way. Don't think of it as, oh, that was a waste of time. I'm not going to do that. At least you've made the effort to look at it. But gradually, bit by bit, as you sort of think that's not for me, or that might be for me, you'll find a direction that attracts you. What's useful to do, I'm not trying to sell you my book, but in my book, there's this thing called a core values exercise. It's really, really useful to do because a lot of you will have done it anyway, if you've had any kind of life coaching or anything like that. But out of your core values for your drivers, what drives you? Is it recognition? Is it money? Is it contribution? And that makes you realize. So I've got a GP colleague who suddenly wants to work in palliative care because actually that really aligns with her values and is much more the kind of work. She's still using her GP skills, So I think that's the thing, working out what you like, being true to yourself and trying to align things that feel right.
Thank you very much for your time. And I look forward to listening to more of your podcasts. If you haven't listened to Saving Lives in Slow Motion, make sure you check it out. It's really interesting. It's bite-sized podcast, 15 minutes, really useful. If you found this video useful, then I'm sure you're going to get a lot from watching this video. Click the video to watch it. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.